The sound of glass shattering echoed across the floor, cold water spreading into a dark pool. The diner fell silent in an instant. In the center of it all stood Emily Johnson, a waitress in her early 30s, her right arm wrapped in white bandages, trembling with each breath as the tray in her hand tilted, threatening to spill everything onto the ground. And then came a voice, sharp as a blade. "Again? Emily, are you trying to turn this place into a circus?" Mark Benson, the manager in his 40s, his face flushed pink but his eyes gleaming with malice, stormed over and ripped the cloth from her hand. He didn't use it to clean. He only shoved his face close to hers, so close she could smell the sour stench of stale coffee on his breath. The whole diner froze. Some looked at her with pity. Others shook their heads. A few whispers slipped out. "She's working with only one good arm. Why make her do this?" "Mark never lets her breathe easy." Emily heard it all. Every murmur pierced her like thorns. But she bit her lip, lowered her head, whispered an apology, and tried to gather the broken pieces. Inside, the throbbing pain from her fractured arm flared, dragging her back to the nightmarish memory from a few weeks ago. That night, after her shift, she had overheard Mark bragging about skimming money from the diner. When he caught her listening, his eyes sparked with fury. He seized her wrist and twisted hard until a dry crack split the air. Emily collapsed to the floor, gasping through tears as his words seared into her memory. "Stay quiet, or lose everything." Since then, Mark had branded her as clumsy and a troublemaker. He fabricated reports with precision, painting Emily as a liability to upper management, while he continued to smile smugly in his role as the dedicated manager. But there was another pair of eyes that had seen everything. In the corner booth by the fogged-up window sat an old man quietly sipping black coffee. Thomas Miller, in his 60s, with hair the color of ash, a worn denim jacket, and heavy boots dusted from the road. To regulars, he was just the retired veteran who liked his coffee strong. In truth, he was the owner of the diner. For years, Thomas had chosen to remain hidden. He believed only by keeping his true identity concealed could he truly see people's hearts. And that morning, his tired blue eyes followed Emily's every move, from her forced smile to her uneven steps as she balanced trays with one hand. He saw it clearly. That smile was not joy, but armor, fragile and desperate, shielding her from pain. Thomas heard the whispers of customers. "Mark's gone too far. She's holding on by a thread." He tightened his grip on his coffee cup, veins rising on the back of his hand. Inside his chest burned a mix of anger and sorrow. He had seen men in power abuse their rank during his years in the military, and he knew well, wounds to the spirit cut deeper than any knife. Meanwhile, Emily pressed on. Sweat dampened the back of her neck, her one good arm strained from carrying the weight. She still bowed to customers with a shaky voice. "Enjoy your meal." But the moment she turned, bumping into Mark and spilling the glass, everything seemed to collapse. Mark shouted, customers shook their heads, and Emily could only swallow her tears. Thomas sat motionless, but in his eyes flickered a steely resolve. He could no longer remain silent. At the next table, 2 office workers whispered, "She deserves a break." "Yeah, but Mark will never allow it." Emily heard that too. Her heart sank heavier. Quit. Impossible. Rent, medical bills, the relentless numbers waiting for her. She had no way out. Thomas saw her despair. He realized the woman with the bandaged arm wasn't just clinging to her job, she was clinging to her dignity. That morning's story ended in suffocating stillness. Emily stood, trembling, eyes brimming with tears. Mark folded his arms with a smug grin, convinced he still held control. Customers glanced at one another, uneasy but unwilling to intervene. And Thomas, he took one final sip of coffee, his eyes cold and sharp as steel. In his heart, a vow echoed, "The truth will come to light, and those who abuse power will never again laugh at another's pain." The clatter of plates and dishes rang out in a relentless rhythm. At peak hour, the diner felt like a massive machine fueled by human effort. The hiss of the grill, overlapping voices of customers calling orders, and the thick air heavy with the smell of grease and frying oil. In the middle of the chaos, Emily Johnson moved like a wounded bird struggling to keep its wings aloft. One arm held a tray, the other bound stiff in bandages, every movement sending a flicker of pain across her face. Yet she forced a smile. To customers, it was courtesy. To Mark Benson, the 40-something manager, that smile was nothing more than prey for him to crush. "Faster, Emily. Table 5's been waiting all day." His voice cut through the noise. She nodded and quickened her pace, but as she set down a bowl of soup, sweat dripped into her palm. Mark sauntered across, leaning an elbow on the counter, smirking in front of the guests. "See that? One person, working like 3 bumbling fools rolled into one." His harsh, mocking laugh burned into her, and Emily flushed crimson, lowering her head and whispering faintly, "I'm sorry." Inside, memories of that fateful night returned. The office door slamming shut, Mark's voice boasting, "A few more thousand skimmed, no one will ever know." She had paused while wiping a table and caught every word. When she turned, he was already at the door, his face darkening, his grip clamped around her wrist like a vice. The sickening crack of bone. Emily collapsed, gasping through tears, and his foul breath of coffee and stale cigarettes hissed in her ear. "Stay silent, or lose your job, and more than that." Since that night, her arm had been in a cast, but Mark twisted it further, painting her as incompetent. Report after report piled up. Spilled drinks, slow service, customer complaints. He made her the scapegoat, shielding himself while siphoning from the cash register. Customers saw it, many times, shaking their heads in frustration. Some whispered with pity, "She should be resting, but she probably needs the money." Emily heard it all. Her chest tightened. But when she returned each night to her tiny rented room, staring at the stack of medical bills, she knew she had no right to give up. In the corner booth, Thomas Miller, a silver-haired man in his 60s, sat straight, backed, his eyes sharp as blades. He didn't just see injustice, he saw the way Emily endured it. The pain, both physical and humiliating, and yet she still served without ceasing. Thomas sipped his coffee, anger and sorrow churning inside. He had once commanded young soldiers, had witnessed officers abuse their power, and he knew one truth: silence in the face of injustice was complicity. Mark was different. The more eyes on him, the more he reveled. When Emily dropped a fork, he didn't let it pass. He pointed at her, turning to the table of guests. "See that? That's the quality I deal with every day." The customers chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether to agree or protest. Emily bent down to pick it up, her good hand trembling violently. Her cheeks burned hot, but her eyes stayed dry. Her tears had long since run out. Thomas clenched his aged hand, the old ring on his finger catching the yellow light. He restrained his fury, waiting, watching. Something deeper was hidden, and he resolved, if Mark spoke truth, he would hear it. But if he lied, Thomas would expose it all. By the lunch break, the crowd thinned. Emily wiped the counter, exhaling shakily. Her bandaged wrist trembled when she bent too far. In that moment, Thomas saw her eyes blur with tears, not from physical pain, but from despair. And Mark? He lounged at the counter, eyes glued to his phone, chuckling. When Emily begged for help carrying a stack of heavy dishes, he glanced up, smirked, and said, "Use both hands. Oh, wait, you can't." His cruel laugh sliced through the quiet of the diner. Some customers frowned. One man muttered under his breath, "What a bastard." Emily pressed her lips tight, nodding faintly as if swallowing the humiliation whole. But deep inside, a small spark flickered. Thomas saw that spark, and he knew if no one stood up, it would die. But if someone fueled it, it could blaze into a torch. He quietly set down his coffee cup, his gaze steady as steel. In his mind echoed a vow to himself. Tomorrow the game will turn, and Mark Benson will never again laugh at her pain. Night fell, and the diner slowly emptied. The last customers drifted out, leaving behind the orchid smell of burnt coffee and the creak of the ceiling fan in the wide, dim space. Emily Johnson cleared to the greasy tables, each heavy step feeling like it pressed down on her own heart. The cast on her arm cracked faintly whenever she turned too sharply, and the haunting memory came rushing back like a shadow that never left. That night, just a few weeks ago, the office door at the back of the diner had been left slightly ajar, a faint light spilling through. Emily, still whole then, had merely been passing by. She caught the sound of Mark Benson's rasping, arrogant laugh. "Easy. Another $5,000 gone. No one will ever notice. Customers don't pay attention, and who's checking the books anyway?" The hiss of a beer bottle opening, the coarse chuckle of some drinking buddy carried out. Emily froze, her heart pounding. $5,000? In her mind flashed the image of her unpaid rent, the stack of medical bills climbing higher every week. She had never imagined that right here, in the place she worked, the manager was stealing every hard-earned dollar. She stepped back quietly, but the old hinge betrayed her with a creak. The door swung wider, and Mark appeared. His eyes darkened instantly when he saw her. "How long have you been standing there?" His voice was cold, stripped of any polite pretense. Emily stammered, I was just passing by. I didn't hear anything." Mark advanced, his leather shoes pounding the floor like war drums. He grabbed her wrist and twisted hard. A sickening crack split the air, the brittle snap of bone. Emily gasped in agony, collapsing to the floor. Tears spilled as she begged, her voice shaking. "Please, please, sir." He leaned close, his breath reeking of alcohol and stale beer washing over her face. "Listen to me, Emily. You saw nothing. You know nothing. If you dare whisper a word, this hand is just the beginning." He released her, leaving her crumpled on the cold tile floor. The pain blazing from her wrist consumed her, searing away every thought. That night, clutching her swollen arm, she quietly hailed a cab to the emergency room. And from the next day, the white bandage on her hand became a living mark of Mark's cruelty, but also the chain that bound her. Back to the present. Emily wiped down the counter, moving like a ghost. Those memories never left her. Each time Mark barked at her, she felt herself shrinking, helpless, driven into a corner of fear. But in the eyes of Thomas Miller, the diner's silent observer in the corner booth, he saw a different story. A woman of extraordinary resilience. That evening, Thomas didn't leave right away. He stayed seated, slowly turning the cold cup of coffee in his hand. His aged eyes followed Emily as she lifted chairs one by one with her single good arm. He saw it clearly. She wasn't clumsy. She was a warrior being suffocated. When Mark slammed his office door and his raspy laugh spilled out, Thomas closed his eyes. He had served in the army, had once faced commanders who turned war into a business. He recognized that voice, the voice of a man who thrived on lies. For a moment, his thoughts drifted back to young soldiers who had fallen because their superiors hid their mistakes. His chest tightened. He would not allow history to repeat itself, not even in a small diner. Emily now leaned against the counter, sweat plastered to her forehead. She whispered a prayer no one else could hear. "Please, don't let tomorrow be the same as today." What she did not know was that tomorrow truly would be different, because Thomas had seen enough. He rose, leaving a few bills on the table, and walked toward the door. His shadow stretched long across the diner floor, but in his eyes burned a fierce light. He whispered to himself alone, "I will expose the truth, and he will pay the price." Outside, the night wind howled through the trees, like an overture for the battle about to begin. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the dusty windows of the diner. The clinking of spoons and forks, the drip of coffee, and the chatter of customers blended into a familiar, chaotic symphony. But in Thomas Miller's heart, another rhythm beat. The rhythm of waiting. He chose his usual corner table again. A steaming cup of black coffee sat before him. The rim of the ceramic chipped, but his eyes never left the floor of the diner. To the other patrons, he was no one special, just a man in his 60s, his silver hair unkempt, his denim jacket worn thin. To them, he was only a retired veteran who spent his days people watching. No one suspected that he was the true owner of the entire place. Emily Johnson appeared, walking slowly, her bandaged arm pressed tightly against her body. Her face was pale from lack of sleep, yet a strained smile was painted across her lips. Thomas watched her the way one might watch a warrior heading into battle with a broken sword. Each time Emily balanced a heavy tray with her one good arm, Thomas felt his own heartbeat quicken. He had once led young soldiers into brutal combat, yet what he witnessed now unsettled him more deeply. A woman silently fighting against injustice. Mark Benson, by contrast, strutted across the diner as if it belonged to him. He flashed shallow smiles at customers, tossed out cheap jokes to make them laugh. But whenever Emily passed, his expression shifted. His eyes turned cold. His voice sharpened into cruel mockery. "Hurry up, Emily, or are you trying to turn the customers into statues?" he sneered, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. A few patrons frowned. A young couple whispered, "She's doing her best." "That manager is cruel." Emily heard every word, her heart aching, but she bowed her head, hiding her tears behind a crooked smile. Thomas lifted his cup, but did not drink. His eyes glimmered with restrained fury. He had run businesses, encountered every kind of person: laziness, greed, cruelty. Mark embodied them all. But what enraged Thomas most was the cowardice of a man who preyed on a vulnerable employee to conceal his own crimes. Later that day, as the diner quieted near noon, Thomas decided to act. He tapped the table gently and called out, "I'd like to see the manager." Mark approached, his shoulders puffed like a rooster. "What's wrong, old man? Coffee too cold? Eggs undercooked?" His tone dripped with arrogance. Thomas shook his head, his voice calm, but his gaze piercing. "I just wonder, why is someone injured still being forced to work? That waitress, Emily." For a split second, Mark's smile faltered. Then he recovered, waving dismissively. "Oh, she's clumsy, always messing things up. But she begged me to stay, so I gave her a chance. I'm generous like that." Thomas said nothing, only nodded. But inside, each word from Mark sliced at his conscience like a dull blade. Generous. He had heard Mark's mocking laughter the night before, seen Emily's trembling hand every time she moved her wrist. He knew that was nothing but a cheap performance. By late afternoon, as the crowd thinned, Thomas sat over his third cup of coffee, now cold. His eyes never left Emily. He saw her wince when she twisted her arm too far. He saw her avoid Mark's gaze the way prey avoids the predator's teeth. And he knew her fear was no accident. It had been fed by violence and threats. As night fell, Mark withdrew to his office. The coarse laughter of him and his drinking companion spilled out. Another few thousand skimmed. Relax, when money goes missing, the one who gets blamed is Emily. My reports are full of her mistakes. Who would believe her? Thomas sat silently in the dim hallway, his hand trembling. He heard every word, and when Mark lowered his voice, it chilled Thomas to his very core. Besides, that arm of hers, I twisted it enough to keep her reminded. A pause, then laughter erupted. Thomas closed his eyes, the veins in his neck taut. He had endured enough. This was not just an unworthy manager. This was an user, a traitor to his trust, a parasite gnawing away at the very place he had built with sweat and sacrifice. He stepped out the back door, letting the night wind lash across his face. In his chest, his heart pounded like a siren. For the first time in years, the soldier's instinct surged back to life. He whispered, like a vow, "Tomorrow, the mask will fall." The next morning, the diner hummed with its usual rhythm, the sizzle of grease in the pans, the clang of knives on cutting boards, the smell of coffee mixing with the scent of smoked bacon. But in Thomas Miller's mind, no sound could drown out the coarse laughter he had heard the night before. Every word Mark Benson had spat still rang in his ears, sharp as a blade. That arm of hers, I twisted it enough to keep her reminded. He sat at his usual corner table, a cup of black coffee in front of him. Outside, customers came and went, rushing as always. But for Thomas, today was not like every other day. Today, he was not just the old regular. Today, he was the hunter. Emily Johnson kept her head down, forcing a smile to cover the pain. Her eyes were shadowed from sleepless nights, but her voice was still soft as she murmured, "Enjoy your meal." Thomas tightened his grip on the handle of his cup. He knew that if he stayed silent, this young woman would be crushed, and Mark would continue to revel in his deceit. At midday, when the diner had thinned, Thomas rose and walked slowly down the hallway, pretending to look for the restroom. But his true destination was the office door, Mark's so-called private domain. The door was unlocked. Thomas pushed it open quietly. The room was dark, the stench of liquor and stale smoke thick in the air. Papers were scattered across the desk. He stepped closer, his aged eyes scanning the stacks of files. Disciplinary reports piled high like a wall. At the top of every page was the same name, Emily Johnson. Spilled water. Customer complaint. Slow service. Every minor mistake had been twisted into official records, a meticulous scheme designed to crush her. Thomas drew a deep breath, his chest heavy as stone. He had run businesses, seen fraud, but he had never witnessed cruelty so calculated. He turned to another stack, a ledger of income and expenses. The numbers didn't match, a few hundred missing one day, thousands the next. The deeper he read, the clearer the truth became. Mark was stealing from the diner and pinning the blame entirely on Emily. His fist tightened, the paper trembling in his calloused hand. "Just as I thought," he muttered. At that moment, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Thomas quickly pulled the door to, retreating into the shadows. Through the crack, he saw Mark enter, followed by a stout man in a wrinkled shirt. The two were laughing crudely. The sound of a beer cap popping filled the room. "Another $5,000, easy as pie," Mark bragged, collapsing into his chair. The other man roared with laughter. "Careful, what if that girl Emily talks?" Mark shrugged, lifting his beer. "Relax. I already broke her arm. Now she wouldn't dare open her mouth." Thomas stood frozen in the dark. Each word scraped against his conscience like sandpaper on raw flesh. He heard the gloating laughter, the clink of beer. His blood rushed to his face, but he held back. It wasn't time to strike yet. He needed proof, and now he had it. When Mark and his drinking buddy finally left, Thomas emerged, his eyes cold and hard like a general before battle. He understood his enemy completely now. All that remained was the moment to strike. That night, he didn't go home right away. He stayed in his corner of the diner, the dim room lit only by the flicker of a yellow bulb. Emily was still wiping tables with one hand, sweat dripping down her face. But her eyes were different now. Beneath the exhaustion, there was a faint glimmer, a fragile hope that one day justice would prevail. Thomas watched her, and within him rose an iron resolve. Tomorrow, the mask will fall. Mark Benson will no longer hide behind lies, and Emily will have her dignity restored. He sat upright, his gaze unyielding. For the first time in years, Thomas felt his blood surge like it had on the battlefield. Not because of bombs or bullets, but because of a fight for justice within the very walls he had built. Outside, the night wind howled against the tin roof. Inside, a plan was quietly set in motion. And Thomas knew, by tomorrow morning, this diner would witness a devastating truth. That morning, sunlight streamed through the diner windows, exposing every speck of dust floating in the air. The place buzzed with its usual chaos, the crackle of frying pans, the murmur of conversations, the clinking of spoons against cups. Yet beneath that familiar layer of noise, a storm was waiting to break. Thomas Miller sat in his usual corner, the same faded denim jacket, the same cup of strong black coffee. But today, he did not sit like an old regular. His shoulders were taut, his eyes sharp, his back straight like a soldier bracing for the call to charge. Emily Johnson moved through the crowd of customers, balancing a heavy tray on her one good arm. Her face was pale, but she forced a smile. Each time she passed Mark Benson, that smile faltered. Mark, meanwhile, laughed loudly, joking with customers, though his predatory glances at Emily revealed the cruelty simmering beneath. And then the moment arrived. Thomas tapped his spoon against his coffee cup. The metallic clang was small, yet it silenced the entire diner. Conversations stopped, eyes turned toward the corner. Emily froze mid-step, her heart racing. Mark scowled, then sneered. "What now, old man? Coffee too cold?" Thomas rose. He walked steadily to the center of the diner, scanning the room, his voice cutting through the air. "Good morning, everyone. It's time you all knew who I really am." Mark burst into mocking laughter, clapping his hands. "Hear that? The old man's writing his memoirs." But his grin vanished when Thomas declared with unwavering clarity, "I am the owner of this diner." The room froze. A customer dropped a fork onto their plate with a loud clatter. Emily's eyes widened, her lips parted, but no sound came. Mark stumbled back, his face draining of color as though his blood had been drained from him. Thomas pulled a thick folder from his jacket and slammed it onto the counter. Papers scattered, exposing falsified reports, mismatched ledgers, copies of missing cash records. His voice thundered. "Mark Benson, I've seen enough. Every fake report you pinned on Emily, every dollar you stole from this diner, and the night you broke her arm to force her silence. It's all here." The diner erupted in murmurs. A woman whispered, "I knew it. I saw him torment Emily so many times." Mark stammered, his face flushed red. You have no proof." "Old man, you're imagining things." Thomas didn't answer. The diner doors swung open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, sunlight gleaming on their badges. The room fell silent. Mark froze, his eyes darting wildly. Wait, this isn't—" The metallic click of handcuffs cut him short. The sound was final. Mark thrashed, shouting, "No, I'm being set up! You can't!" His words drowned in the noise of the crowd. Customers murmured, some clapped, others cheered. "Finally, it's over!" Emily stood frozen, her good hand pressed to her chest. For the first time in months, the shadow of Mark no longer loomed over her. Thomas turned to her, his voice softening, like a father speaking to his child. "You've kept this place running with every ounce of your strength, Emily. Today, you're no longer just a waitress. From now on, you are floor supervisor." Emily choked, her bandaged hand trembling as she covered her mouth. Tears streamed down, but they were no longer from pain. They were from release. The diner filled with applause, a wave of sound washing away the heaviness that had lingered for so long. Mark was dragged out, his shouts fading into the roar of the police car engine. Inside, the diner still smelled of burnt coffee and frying grease, but the air was lighter than ever. Thomas returned to his corner table, sat down, and lifted his now cold coffee. A rare smile crept across his face. Emily wiped her tears at the counter, then raised her head high. For the first time, she was no longer the clumsy waitress, but someone finally seen for her true worth. In the hearts of everyone present that morning, one truth rang clear. Justice may come late, but it always arrives. And those who sow misery will sooner or later pay the price. The diner door closed as the police car drove away. The sirens faded into the distance, carrying with them the chaos and fear that had once suffocated this place. Inside, it felt as though a heavy weight had been lifted. The smell of burnt coffee lingered, the sizzle of oil still popped in the kitchen. Yet something had changed. The air felt clearer, lighter. Emily Johnson stood silently behind the counter. Her good hand clutched the rag tightly, while the bandaged one trembled. Tears streamed down her face, but they were no longer tears of humiliation. These were tears of release. The months of pressure and disdain had finally been washed away in a single moment. Customers remained seated, some clapping softly, their eyes filled with empathy and admiration. A couple whispered to each other, "She's so resilient." Yes, if it were me, I'd have quit long ago. Emily heard it all, and for the first time, those whispers were not daggers piercing her heart, but invisible arms lifting her up. From his usual corner, Thomas Miller took a final sip of his coffee. His eyes that had witnessed war and seen blood and tears mingle, watched the young woman. But what he saw now was not collapse. It was rebirth. He stood, walked slowly towards the counter. The customers fell silent, parting to make way. Emily looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Thomas laid his weathered hand on her shoulder, his voice deep and warm. "Emily, you have not only kept this diner alive, you have shown me the true strength of patience. From today, you are floor supervisor. And remember, you no longer carry this burden alone." Emily broke down, covering her mouth with her bandaged hand to muffle her sobs. But everyone in the diner heard, and then applause rose again, this time not scattered, but strong and unified, filling every corner of the room. In that moment, Emily was no longer the clumsy waitress. She was a victor, a living reminder of the truth. Villains may sow suffering, but they can never extinguish the light of justice. Outside, the midday sun streamed through the glass, illuminating her face. Emily lifted her head, inhaled deeply, her shoulders straighter, her gaze steadier. She had walked through the storm, and a new dawn awaited her. Thomas returned to his table, sitting down as he always did. But this time, he smiled, a rare, soft smile of relief and fulfillment. He knew his mission was done. He had not only unmasked a traitor, but restored faith to someone who truly deserved it. Customers left the diner still buzzing about what had happened. The story of Mark would spread, a reminder that power built on lies lasts only until the light of truth shines upon it. Emily wiped away the last of her tears and returned to work. But now her steps were firmer, her eyes brighter. And when she greeted a new customer walking in, her voice was no longer shaky, but steady and confident. "Welcome. Please, have a seat." In that moment of peace, Thomas closed his eyes, letting the chatter and the sounds of the kitchen surround him. Within, he heard a message both simple and profound. Never underestimate the quiet strength of those who keep standing, even when the world tries to break them. Justice may come late, but it always finds the guilty. And resilience, though often overlooked, is the truest power. Outside, a gentle breeze swept past. A new dawn for Emily had begun. And the diner, after months of darkness, finally shone again in the pure air of justice. In business as in life, justice may come late, but it never fails to arrive. Emily's story reminds us that quiet resilience is true strength, while deceit and cruelty will always be exposed in time. If you believe that truth and fairness are always worth defending, then press like and subscribe to help us share more inspiring stories. And don't forget to leave a comment with the words justice, because your voice, too, can help create change.